of our state and in the civil war which followed.
But it hasn't been forgotten today, as relatives of those who died gather on the seafront in Dunleary. Among them is Jenny Kelly, who was just 6 months old when her father died in the tragedy 90 years ago.
He was a sorter on the mailboat to Holyhead, and just unfortunately where he was happened to be working, you know what I mean, and he hadn't a chance then, obviously. So my eldest brother, he had a big family too, and he went there to see if could he identify him. I'm very proud, really, and it was not before time either. Took too long, considering that I'd no contact at all with him. Really very emotional about it. I know he was a good dad. And I mean a good dad. Because he had the family to prove it.
Also attending the service are 3 sisters from Canada, France and the Isle of Man, whose grandparents died on the Leinster.
I thought it was brilliant. It was very, very moving, and the music was very, very good. It was
very
really
nice to involve the children, and to make sure that they know.
It was just a wonderful opportunity to at last be able to pay our respects to our grandparents, who we obviously never met, but it was a story in our family that was very, very important to us all.
My grandparents, they were on the way to see my grandmother's brother, Christopher, who was fighting for the British Army, and he was very badly wounded, and she was going to see him, and at the last moment my grandfather decided to go with her, and they were both killed and left 10 children, the youngest who was a year and a half, and the youngest girl was only 4. And they were all sent to boarding school, except for the youngest child, who was adopted by John and Lily McCormick. To this day, the effect it had on my father and his siblings, there was 10 of them, and it had a huge difference. I think it made a huge difference to the way they were brought up and what they did in later life and who we met because of the places we lived in and where we ended up.
And in Dunleary itself, the story of the Leinster lives strong in the memory. Michael Lee's family has lived locally for generations. He lost one of his granduncles in the Leinster tragedy, while another died fighting in the First World War.
My granduncle, Joe, he was killed very early on in 1915 in Gallipoli, and that was obviously a huge tragedy to the family. You know, they lost one of their sons. But however, the war went on for another 3 years, and they must have felt by the 10th of the 10th, 1918, that they had been spared in many ways. From what I gather from the family history, my great uncle Ernest, he was returning back from leave here, back to his field ambulance in France. Again, he was on the boat on that fateful day, and that's when the torpedo and the tragedy happened. To have him lost on the Leinster must have been just the final blow for my great-grandfather and grandmother. There was amazing letters that I came across some years ago, and they were to Tennyson, who was the son who had been at Gallipoli the same time as Joe had been killed there in 1915. And he was obviously in England at the time. And these are letters. What's interesting about the first letter is written on the day after the sinking. It's written on the 11th of October 1918. And of course it's heartbreaking when you read what's in it. My own dear boy Tennyson, you will have seen no doubt from the papers the terrible tragedy which occurred to the mailboat yesterday. I fear our very dear and loved son Ernest is no more in this world. There's no account of him dead or alive. He left by the boat. The Leinster was torpedoed on Thursday morning and she was sunk inside an hour. Oh, the horror of it. Your poor mother is bearing up as well as can be expected, but God alone knows the sorrow that we feel. Mother and Ted join in unified love to our dear boy. Your loving and affectionate father, Edward Lee. heaven knows what they went through, because anyone who has a family who has children can understand the tragedy of losing children, and to lose two like that, and particularly one at the last days of the war, must have been appalling. So Ireland did not escape in any way the First World War, and it went, as I say, up to the very last minute, the last month of the war, there was this huge tragedy. So it had a huge bearing on the country as well as families.
The Germans themselves were just as much victims in this story. Germany was blockaded by the Royal Navy, and people were starving. No food could get through. These were all young men. The boat commander was the oldest. He was 27, a married man with 2 children. And his crew were all aged 19 and 20. And they were lost on the way back to Germany when their submarine struck a minefield in the North Sea, and they would have all died terrible deaths. They were just as much victims. Nobody wins in war. Everybody is a victim.
When the Dublin mailboat Leinster was sunk in the Irish Sea,
remembering those who died when the mailboat Leinster was sunk in the Irish Sea. There were more than 300 soldiers on board, and while not all of their bodies were recovered, those that were brought here to Grange Gorman Cemetery in Dublin. Fergus Darcy is the author of the book Remembering the War Dead, and that's a publication that deals with how we remember, or didn't, those who died in the Great War. Fergus, first of all, why were they all brought here to Grange Gorman?
Well, there are 2 principal reasons, Mary. The first is that Grange Gorman was the designated military cemetery for British Army people in the Dublin region, and had been so since 1876. And the second reason is that the scale of the catastrophe was such that they simply had to find a place quickly that could accommodate the large number, over 140.
And why are the headstones all of the same shape?
Well, this was something that the Imperial War Graves Commission, or today the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, had decided on after much argument around the early 1920s. They came up with a standard design that wasn't too large, and that was designed to treat everybody with equality.
I presume, Fergus, that given that the war was fought in France and Belgium, there aren't too many gravestones like this around the country.
Well, in Ireland there's nothing on the scale of what one finds on the continent. But on the other hand, there are over 700 cemeteries on this island with graves of the First and Second World War, over 500 in the Republic, and they contain the remains of over close on 5,000 people who perished.
You have documented them in your book, Remembering the War Dead. Do you think that we in this country now remember them in a fitting way, or is there more to be done?
Well, I suppose one could say there's always more to be done, but I would have to say that in the course of the last 25 years, there's been a veritable revolution in our remembrance, in our remembering, both at the level of central government, local government, and I think more than anything else perhaps due to the efforts of individuals in towns and villages throughout Ireland. And one can have splendid memorials from the reconstructed Island Bridge Memorial Park to the very modest memorial